This is the moment that could shatter American democracy as we know it. At exactly 11:47 p.m. on Friday, February 13th, 2026, President Trump posted to Truth Social what constitutional scholars are calling the most dangerous threat to federalism in American history. There will be voter ID for the midterm elections, whether approved by Congress or not, he declared. This wasn't campaign rhetoric. This was a sitting president announcing his intention to override the Constitution through executive fiat. Within 72 hours of the House passing his election takeover bill by the narrowest possible margin, Trump is now threatening to bypass Congress entirely and seize control of America's voting system. The constitutional crisis that experts have been warning about for months is no longer theoretical. It's happening right now. To understand the magnitude of what Trump is attempting, we need to trace how this unprecedented power grab evolved. It began on February 2nd, 2026, when Trump appeared on Dan Bongino's podcast and made a statement that sent shockwaves through the constitutional law community. The Republicans should say, we want to take over, we should take over the voting in at least many 15 places. The Republicans ought to nationalize the voting, Trump told the former FBI deputy director. When pressed about the constitutionality of such an action, Trump doubled down during a bill signing ceremony in the Oval Office the next day. If a state can't run an election, I think the people behind me should do something about it, he said, surrounded by Republican lawmakers. Because, if you think about it, the state is an agent for the federal government in elections. I don't know why the federal government doesn't do them anyway. This statement reveals a fundamental misunderstanding of American constitutional law. Article 1, Section 4 of the Constitution explicitly grants states primary authority over elections, with Congress having the power to make or alter state election laws only under specific circumstances. Nowhere does the Constitution grant the president any authority over election administration. As David Becker, a nonpartisan expert on voting procedures, bluntly stated, the founders were very wise in singling out elections as a place where the president has literally no power. Only state legislatures and Congress have the authority to regulate elections, and courts have upheld this many times. Trump's initial comments might have been dismissed as typical provocative rhetoric, but his administration immediately began translating words into action. On Wednesday, February 12th, the House of Representatives passed the Save America Act by a razor-thin margin of 218 to 213. The legislation represents the most restrictive federal voting law ever considered by Congress, requiring Americans to provide documentary proof of citizenship such as a passport or birth certificate to register to vote and mandating photo identification to cast a ballot. Research by the Brennan Center for Justice shows that 21 million Americans lack ready access to these documents, meaning the bill could disenfranchise millions of eligible voters. The House vote revealed the deep partisan divide over election policy. Every single Republican voted for the legislation, while all but one Democrat opposed it. The lone Democrat supporting the bill was Henry Cuellar of Texas, making it one of the most party-line votes on election policy in modern history. Critics immediately blasted the legislation as voter suppression disguised as election security. Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer declared the bill dead on arrival in the Senate, calling it a fringe piece of legislation that has now taken over the Republican Party, masquerading as election security when it's really about laying the groundwork to meddle in the midterm elections. The Senate presents a nearly insurmountable obstacle for Trump's election overhaul. While Republicans control 53 seats, the filibuster requires 60 votes to pass legislation. Republican Senator Lisa Murkowski of Alaska has already come out against the proposal, and only one Democrat, John Fetterman of Pennsylvania, has expressed support for national voter ID requirements, though he opposes other voting restrictions in the bill. This means Trump would need support from at least 7 additional Democrats to pass his legislation through normal legislative channels. Faced with this legislative reality, Trump took to Truth Social on Friday night with his most explosive threat yet. The Democrats refuse to vote for voter ID or citizenship. The reason is very simple. They want to continue to cheat in elections, he posted. This was not what our founders desired. I have searched the depths of legal arguments not yet articulated or vetted on this subject, and will be presenting an irrefutable one in the very near future. There will be voter ID for the midterm elections, whether approved by Congress or not. In a follow-up post, he added, if we can't get it through Congress, there are legal reasons why this scam is not permitted. I will be presenting them shortly in the form of an executive order. This threat to bypass Congress carries particular weight because Trump has already attempted to unilaterally reshape election laws through executive action. In March 2025, he issued a sweeping executive order that attempted to impose documentary proof of citizenship requirements for voter registration, change certification standards for voting machines, standardize mail ballot deadlines, and force federal agencies to assess citizenship before providing voter registration assistance. The order also sought to decertify voting machines used in 39 states within 180 days, potentially costing states billions of dollars and leaving them without feasible voting systems for the 2026 elections. The legal response to Trump's previous executive order was swift and devastating. Multiple lawsuits were filed immediately, led by the Brennan Center for Justice and other voting rights organizations. Federal Judge Colleen Collar-Cotelli issued a permanent injunction blocking key provisions of the order, ruling that Trump had exceeded his constitutional authority. Our Constitution entrusts Congress and the states, not the president, with the authority to regulate federal elections. Judge Collar-Cotelli wrote, "No statutory delegation of authority to the executive branch permits the president to short-circuit Congress's deliberative process by executive order." Her ruling specifically noted that the framers of our Constitution recognized that power over election rules could be abused, either to destroy the national government or to disempower the people from acting as a check on their elected representatives. Despite these court defeats, the Trump administration has continued its unprecedented assault on state election systems through other means. The Department of Justice has sued 24 states plus Washington, D.C. for refusing to provide comprehensive voter registration data, demanding unredacted voter rolls that states argue would compromise citizens' privacy and security. States including California, Michigan, Oregon, and Minnesota have successfully resisted these demands in court, with judges reaffirming states' rights to protect their voter information. The administration's most shocking action came with the FBI raid on the Fulton County Elections Office in Georgia. Federal agents executed a search warrant and collected election materials, including ballots from the 2020 election. The raid drew widespread condemnation from election officials and legal experts, particularly because the presence of Director of National Intelligence Tulsi Gabbard at the scene remains unexplained. Local officials are exploring legal options to challenge what they view as federal intimidation of state election administration. The constitutional implications of Trump's election nationalization push cannot be overstated. The United States has operated with decentralized election administration for nearly 250 years, with more than 10,000 local election jurisdictions managing the process. This decentralized system was intentionally designed by the founders to prevent exactly the kind of federal takeover Trump is attempting. As CNN reported, election experts warn that the president is pushing to upend a system that is already built to prevent widespread election interference, and anyone suggesting a federal takeover hasn't reckoned with the logistical nightmare it would unleash on voters and election officials. State and local election officials are preparing for an unprecedented confrontation with federal authorities. Oregon Secretary of State Tobias Reed told Stateline, "I don't think we can put anything past this administration. I think they're increasingly desperate, increasingly scared about what's going to happen when they are held accountable by American voters. So we have to be prepared for everything." Reed has been meeting with county clerks in the Portland metro area specifically to discuss potential federal pressure over voter rolls, indicating that state officials are actively preparing resistance strategies. The timing of Trump's election takeover attempt is particularly significant because it comes just months before the 2026 midterm elections. Public polling shows overwhelming support for voter ID requirements, with 83% of Americans favoring the concept, according to Pew Research. However, the specific implementation Trump is demanding through the Save America Act goes far beyond simple ID requirements, mandating documentary proof of citizenship that millions of Americans lack. The Brennan Center warns that the legislation would stop millions of American citizens from voting and would be the most restrictive voting bill ever passed by Congress. Congressional Republicans themselves appear divided on Trump's federalization push. Senate Majority Leader John Thune bluntly stated, "I'm not in favor of federalizing elections, even while supporting the SAVE Act's citizenship requirements." When asked about Trump's nationalization comments, Thune tried to reframe them as support for the legislation rather than federal takeover of election administration. This suggests that even within Trump's own party, there is resistance to the most extreme aspects of his election power grab. The international implications of America's election crisis are also becoming apparent. Foreign observers have noted that Trump's demands for federal control over voting mirror tactics used by authoritarian leaders worldwide to consolidate power. The unprecedented nature of a sitting president threatening to override constitutional election procedures has raised questions about American democratic stability that could impact everything from trade relationships to military alliances. Legal scholars are warning that Trump's threatened executive order could trigger the most significant constitutional crisis since the Civil War. Unlike previous disputes over election policy, this confrontation directly challenges the fundamental federal structure of American government. If Trump follows through on his threat and issues an executive order mandating voter ID requirements, it would force the Supreme Court to definitively rule on the extent of presidential power over elections. Such a ruling could either validate an unprecedented expansion of executive authority or deliver a crushing rebuke that further undermines Trump's legitimacy. The practical implications for the 2026 midterms are staggering. If Trump's executive order survives initial court challenges, it could throw election administration into chaos just months before voters go to the polls. State election officials would face the impossible choice of complying with potentially unconstitutional federal mandates or risking federal prosecution and loss of funding. Voting rights organizations are already preparing legal challenges, but the compressed timeline means any disputes might not be resolved before Election Day. Behind the legal and political maneuvering lies a stark reality about Trump's motivations. His push for federal election control is explicitly based on false claims of widespread voter fraud, particularly his continued insistence that he won the 2020 election. Trump has launched an FBI investigation into Fulton County election results, despite providing no credible evidence of irregularities. As his Truth Social posts demonstrate, he views Democratic opposition to his voting restrictions as proof of cheating rather than legitimate policy disagreement. The response from voting rights organizations has been unequivocal. The Brennan Center for Justice warned that the fight for a free and fair vote is taking shape, and that Trump's efforts represent his power grab in legislative garb. Organizations are mobilizing legal challenges, state officials are preparing resistance strategies, and advocacy groups are working to educate voters about their rights under existing law, regardless of Trump's threats. What makes this crisis particularly dangerous is that it represents a complete inversion of constitutional principles. For 235 years, American presidents have accepted that they have no role in election administration. Trump is attempting to claim powers that the Constitution explicitly denies him, based on conspiracy theories that courts have repeatedly rejected. His willingness to bypass Congress through executive action represents the kind of authoritarian overreach that the founders specifically designed the Constitution to prevent. The next few weeks will determine whether American democratic institutions can withstand this unprecedented assault. Trump has promised to issue his executive order shortly, setting up an immediate confrontation with federal courts, state governments, and potentially his own party. The Supreme Court may be forced to issue emergency rulings on presidential power that could reshape the balance between federal and state authority permanently. As this constitutional crisis unfolds, the stakes couldn't be higher. The principle of federalism, the independence of state election systems, and the fundamental idea that presidents cannot unilaterally rewrite the rules of democracy are all under direct attack. Trump's election nationalization push represents the most serious threat to American electoral integrity since the founding of the Republic. The question is no longer whether Trump will attempt to seize control of elections, but whether American institutions will be strong enough to stop him.